Hello, everyone. Welcome to one of the first briefings of this year's Black Hat. And we're going to talk to you about Flip Feng Shui. It's a new exploitation vector that we've come up with. And after this talk, you will know how you could use Flip Feng Shui to break VM isolation using Rowhammer. Before we start, I'm going to briefly mention who we are. So my name is Kabe. Here is Ben Grass, and we are security researchers in academia. And this is a photo of us that you can see. This is right after we submitted the Flip Feng Shui work to Usenix for the first time. And soon you're going to realize why we're so happy. It's after a few weeks of work. And so we are a part of a larger security group in Amsterdam, about 20 people or so. And we publish offensive and defensive security research and also sometimes software reliability. And sometimes we think, okay, the attacks that we do or defenses that we do might actually interest people in industry. And this we think is one of them. We hope that you think so too at the end of this talk. All right, so if you were here last year in Amsterdam, you might remember me. I was here with Antonio sitting there, and we were talking about memory deduplication and how you could use it as a read primitive to sort of read information from a victim VM that is on the same host running with you. And we told you how you can use it to break ASLR. We are back again this time with memory deduplication, but this time it's physical. We're going to show you how you can use memory deduplication to manipulate physical memory of a victim VM so that you could make targeted Rowhammer bit flips. And we show you how you could use this to compromise OpenSSH. There are a bunch of things that we're going to show you. We're going to show you, as I said, an OpenSSH compromise. We're going to show you how you could use this Flip Feng Shui method to compromise apt-get and forge GPG signatures so that a victim VM could install packages without it being bothered that it is not a package that it should install. And all of these things that we're going to show you, they don't rely on any software bug. They only rely on a hardware glitch. And they all rely on weak assumptions. So basically, if you have a vulnerable DIM, which seems to be quite common, about 90% of the DIMs that are sold today are vulnerable to Rowhammer, as shown by the original Rowhammer research. And if you have memory deduplication turned on, then you're already vulnerable to Flip Feng Shui. And we have been contacted by many companies that are worried about this because they are using memory deduplication. And finally, we're going to show you a demo. We have actually implemented Flip Feng Shui on multiple instances, and we're going to show you a demo of one. All right, with this, I would like to give the floor to Ben, who's going to tell you more about how Flip Feng Shui works.
Great. Thank you very much, Kaveh. Hello, everyone. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the outline for the rest of this talk. So then the first phase is going to be, let's forget about how it actually works, the exact technical details of how it works, but let's just say, once it does work, how does this primitive work? We've already been told we can flip bits, we can corrupt memory in a co-hosted victim VM, but what exactly are the conditions under which it works? So how does this write primitive work, as we're calling it? How does it work, and what do I need to know to do it? Okay, so once we know that, let's go into detail about how it works exactly. So which techniques have to come together to make Flip Feng Shui work, and how come it works that way? Once we understand how it works and how we can apply it, we're going to show you a whole bunch of interesting demonstration attacks. The first is going to be OpenSSH. And we are going to be able to log in using OpenSSH into a victim VM. Given that we know the public key of the target, we're going to be able to generate our own private key and log in, totally according to the rules. SSH is going to let us in because that's what it's supposed to do when it's presented with the right key. And once we're in, we're going to show a couple of example attacks of how could we then, assuming that we're not root in the first instance, how could we elevate our privilege higher, and what are a number of possible attacks that we could do to do this, also using Flip Feng Shui, of course. And a final attack is an apt-get subversion demo. So APT is as in the package management system, not as in the threat. But we're going to show you how we're going to be able to generate a GPG signature that apt-get will fully accept as a legitimate signature on an upgraded package, and the victim is going to install it just like it was a normal day. And all of this we're going to accomplish without a software bug, but just using this memory corruption primitive that we're going to tell you about. Okay. Oh, finally. Finally, what is the disclosure, what has the reception been for this work? What's the disclosure been like? And what do we think the takeaway conclusion should be from this talk? Okay, number one, flip Feng Shui at work. So let's forget about how it works for a second and tell you about what are the conditions that need to be true for it to work, and what can you do with it. Okay, so what we're assuming is that you are there are two VMs. One is the attacker, this is you, and one is the victim. And we're on the same machine, and we're assuming that memory deduplication is turned on in the host. And we're going to talk about that later. So what you are going to be able to do is, if you know the contents of a target page in the target VM, you're going to be able to flip one bit, almost any bit, in that target page. So it's a 1-bit write primitive in a page you know the contents of. So this goes some way to explaining the name. Feng Shui is a reference to the ancient Chinese philosophy of the harmonious organization of objects. The modern correspondent of that for us is organizing physical memory so that the Rowhammer glitch will occur exactly where and when we want it to, and for that we use this memory organization technique, in this case, memory deduplication. And the flip is a reference to the Rowhammer glitch, which flips a single bit. So this write primitive is capable, as you can see in this diagram, of breaking the isolation of virtualization, of the strongest possible virtualization available to us today, isolation, this hardware virtualization. So that is one of the significant outcomes of this work. So the takeaway from this slide should be, if you know the contents of a target page in a victim VM, you can write a single bit to it, change a single bit. So it may be an interesting exercise for you, given that you want to subvert the security of a victim VM. What is the cleverest technique and the easiest technique you can think of? Which page you know the contents of, and which bit can I change that will help me with subverting the security? Now we have plenty of nice examples of that, but maybe you can think of a better one. How does it work? So how does it work? We're assuming we're two VMs on the same machine. We're assuming that memory deduplication is turned on in the host so that we can share. We're going to share physical memory. We're assuming that Rowhammer works. So we're going to tell you about how does memory deduplication work, how does Rowhammer work, how and why, and I'm going to tell you the basics about the Rsa crypto system, which is not relevant to flip Feng Shui, but is very relevant to some of the example attacks that we have later, specifically SSH and GPG. So firstly, what is memory deduplication and how does it work? And why would you even do it? So let's say that we are, again, two VMs, and we're both backed by our own private memory. See here? So imagine that this is the virtual address space of one VM, this is the virtual address space of the other VM. These arrows might indicate a virtual memory mapping from virtual to physical memory. And so this is the physical backing memory of the attacker VM, this is the physical backing memory of the victim VM, and they're literally isolated in every possible way. Now, imagine we both store a copy of the Mona Lisa in memory. Let's say it's one page, the Mona Lisa is there, and we both have a copy of Mona Lisa also in our physical memory. Now, the host could realize this, and without any harm to anyone yet, it can deduplicate this page so that we're both sharing the same physical instance of the Mona Lisa. So we point all references to the Mona Lisa to the same single physical page. Nobody's the wiser, but we've saved memory. So many VM hosting providers do this to save memory because there are many of the same pages. If many of the same VMs are running the same operating system, we can save memory and get more customers on the same machine. So how do we want to use this? Well, this is going to help us organize physical memory so that we can use Rowhammer to target the damage. However, to make memory deduplication semantically sound, we have to trap writes, because if one of those owners of the page does a write, say I want to write a curly mustache on Mona Lisa, the victim may not see this, of course, because he has not done the write, so it would not be semantically sound. So we have to reduplicate this page. The attacker I get the Mona Lisa, my own copy of the Mona Lisa. It has a moustache. The victim did not do the write, so it sees the original, and we call this copy on write. So that's an important part of how to keep memory deduplication sound. Okay, Rowhammer. So Rowhammer is a widely occurring glitch in DIM modules. So let's see about these cells. These cells are all, this is the way memory is organized in DRAM chips. All of these little balls represent cells. They're all a single bit. They represent a single bit, and they're in hardware, they're just a capacitor and a transistor. And the capacitor stores charge, and the charge represents whether the bit is a 0 or a 1. Now, they're organized this way in rows, and whenever the RAM controller wants to read from this DRAM, it has to be a row at a time, and the source row is going to be copied to the row buffer, and that's where the memory controller can read the data from. As a side effect of this, and because the capacitors are so small, they are leaking all the time, and that's why they have to be refreshed all the time. You may have heard of this DRAM refresh time. That's what it's doing. You have to keep the bits on, right? Now, as a side effect of copying this row to the row buffer, the source row is electrically empty. It has to be recharged, and as a side effect, the neighboring rows also leak a little bit more than otherwise. Now, if you try to maximize this by, let's say, the Mona Lisa is stored in the middle row, row I, and we're reading from the row above the Mona Lisa and the row below the Mona Lisa like this, then a little bit of charge is going to leak from the Mona Lisa row, see, from the middle row. So if you do this over and over and over and over again, very quickly, faster than the refresh can happen, then it could be that eventually so much charge will leak from the middle row that a bit will actually change from 0 to 1 because so much charge is leaked. We're interpreting that as a different bit now. And then this happens. Oh my goodness. So the Mona Lisa has been defaced by this bit flip, right? Now, Rowhammer is an unpredictable thing. You don't know when and where it will happen, but we have found that it's quite repeatable, it's quite deterministic. So if it happens in one place in a particular way, if we do it again, the same thing will happen. The same bit is likely to flip. And this depends on the physical part of memory. It's sort of a space-dependent phenomenon. So we find that if we go to a new piece of physical memory, we're now in a new piece of physical memory, we do the same Rowhammer operation. Let's see, what kind of damage is going to occur now, and it's the second bit flip, and the Mona Lisa is defaced in a different way. The row causes a different kind of damage, and this is the interpretation of Mona Lisa. Now, imagine that we want a specific kind of damage to occur, which is the curly mustache that we saw earlier. Now, let's go to yet another piece of physical memory. We try the Rowhammer operation in the same time, the same way, and then we get the curly mustache that we wanted. So now we know that if we want to cause this kind of damage, we have to do Rowhammer on this part of physical memory. We call this templating. We can't control where the bit flip happens, but we can find so many different candidates that we can choose where the bit flip happens within a page offset. And that's the important thing here. If we can find within a page offset the right bit flip offset, then we can control where the flip will happen in the target VM. And this is what we call, later on in this talk, we're going to hear this probably more often, we're looking for the right bit flip. That's what we mean by looking for the right bit flip. Find the right physical memory where Rowhammer gives a corruption in the right page offset. So this is how Rowhammer works. Now, put the two together and you can start to see how Flip Feng Shui works. If you've picked a target page in the victim VM and you've decided which bit you want to flip there, then you find a piece of physical memory that produces the right bit flip with respect to a page offset, and then force the victim VM to use that part of physical memory for his data. And you can do this using memory deduplication. That has happened here. The victim is storing the Mona Lisa in the same physical page as the attacker is, and we've been able to, we have forced the deduplication to happen only after we've decided where we want the physical, which physical memory we wanted to use. And we tested this first with Rowhammer. Now they're using the same physical memory. The attacker does Rowhammer in his own VM, and then you get the curly mustache. And of course, they're all the same instance, so the physical memory also gets the curly mustache, and also the victim therefore gets the curly mustache. And that's how you can have this reliable one-bit write primitive using Rowhammer and memory duplication. And as you can see, Flip Feng Shui breaks copy on write, this very important feature that was needed to make memory duplication semantically sound, not to mention for security. So those two things come together. Okay, RSA. I'll just recap the basics of RSA and show you how we're going to use it to cause mischief with OpenSSH and GPG. So RSA is a public key crypto system. That means that whenever you have encryption and decryption, you use one key to encrypt, but that key can only encrypt, and the other key that they're in a pair, the other key can only decrypt. Now, the key that can encrypt, you typically call the public key, because the nice property is it's safe to make this encryption key public. It's very pleasant property. Now, the decryption key you keep private, because that's the one that can unlock the secrets that people are sending you, and vice versa. You can sign things with a private key that can be verified by everyone with the corresponding public key. Now that's also a very pleasant property, because that means that signing things is also a proof of identity, because you're the only person who's supposed to have this private key. Now RSA works using very big numbers. There are 2048, let's say it's the 2048-bit numbers, let's say, and you can compute the private key from a public key by knowing the public key's factorization. Now, of course, we normally don't know the factorization of 2000-bit numbers, but when we generate the key, we just pick two very large primes, multiply them together, and then we know the factorization of the public key, because that's how we generated it. We can very easily compute the corresponding private key. We give the public key to the world, go and encrypt, and they can't figure out the private key because they can't factorize it, because we generated it to be very hard to factorize, but we know the private key. So that's the essence of RSA. The security rests in not being able to factorize public keys. However, if we corrupt a public key using Flip Feng Shui and one bit is all it takes, then the whole world changes for RSA. Because we find here, you see on the x-axis here, is how many different variants of the same number can you find? So how many bit flips in different locations can you give me to test? Then if you have 50 different ones, you're guaranteed for 2048-bit keys, you're already guaranteed to be able to factorize at least one of them within an hour, and one of them is all it takes. We also find that we can make this cutoff for factorization much lower. So here is another indication of trade-off of, so if you make the timeout in your 60 minutes, then eventually you'll be able to factorize practically any of the variants, but if you make the cutoff much less, then it could be 1 minute or 5 minutes, then you can also factorize practically all of them. You just need more variants to get to one of them that you can. So these experiments made us think, well, let's not bother too much with the factorization. Let's focus on getting many different bit flips in the key, and eventually we'll get one that we can factorize and therefore generate the corresponding private key. Because remember, we get to choose which bit we flip. That's the nice thing about that. Okay, now that I've told you all about the background of how this Flip Feng Shui is supposed to work and the important basics of RSA, let me hand the floor to Kave, who can tell you all about how to cause mischief in OpenSSH with this.
Thank you, Ben. All right, so to recap, now Ben told you all about Flip Feng Shui and also told you about RSA, that what happens to RSA if you do a bit flip. Now, I want to briefly mention, so we went through this thought process of what to attack, right? So there are lots of things that you could attack if you have a targeted bit flip. But since we have to, so Rowhammer doesn't happen, so we can't, as Ben said, choose any bit that we want. So we have to wait to find a bit flip that is exploitable for us. So we can't say, I want that specific bit at that offset within a page. And that's why we chose RSA, because RSA, if the public key is large enough, it's going to cover a big part of the page, a physical page. That would mean that we get lots of opportunities to bit flip if we have a public key as our target. All right. With this in mind, let me tell you how the OpenSSH attack works. If you have an OpenSSH server, and typically, probably many of you have done this, right? So you have an OpenSSH server, and you want to log in. So you have your public RSA key pair, and you take the public part of this key pair, this RSA key pair, and you're going to put it into this authorized key file of OpenSSH. And every time you want to now log in using SSH, you're gonna use your private key, and then the OpenSSH server is gonna do a challenge and response to make sure that you are indeed the owner of this public key. One important thing that happens during this challenge and response is that the OpenSSH server is gonna read this authorized key file from its file system, and it's gonna bring it into memory. It's gonna bring it into the page cache. Now there are a number of nice things about this property. One of them is that now the authorized key file is in memory, and which means that we can target it with flip Feng Shui. The other nice property is that page cache is oftentimes page aligned, so we don't have to worry about the alignment of this public key. So here you can see an example of a public key. This is Ben's public key. Want to factorize it?
Damn it.
And then it is a base 64 encoding. So, and then we notice that around 800 or 900 bit flips within a page becomes exploitable when your public key, which is a multiplication of two large number, is stored in memory. So now what the attack looks like is that the attacker is gonna first. The assumption is that we know this public key. Now you assume, so how come you know the public key of a victim VM? Well, there are many possibilities for you to get this public key. So you could, for example, GitHub provides this nice interface for you to probe for any public key that you want. So this is one way to get a public key. And then the attacker would take this public key and writes it to its own memory. And after a while, the memory deduplication is going to see, oh, after a few minutes, there is a duplicate of this information, these pages, and it's going to try to merge them. And if we put this public key in the right location in memory, from the attacker point of view, then this merging is going to put it in the location that we know there will be a bit flip that would let us factorize this public key. And once we have done this bit flip, as Ben showed you with this nice graph, it is going to be quite easy to factorize this public key. And once you know the factors of this public key, it's a simple mathematical operation to get a private key. So now, if you want to log in with this private key, new private key, the OpenSSH server now this time is going to read from its page cache, and it's going to see the corrupted RSA public key, which corresponds to our generated private key, and then you can log in nicely. So if you want to think about it conceptually, so typically if you have the public key, the original public key as a key, so it's really, really hard to open this because it requires immense computational power to factorize this public key to its two primes. But once we do this bit flip, it becomes quite easy to open this lock. So in a sense, it becomes quite easy to open this lock, and then you can easily log in. So if you just replace the Mona Lisa picture that Ben was showing you from the beginning with this public key, now the same attack, the flip Feng Shui attack, would work. Now, you might think that this is like an academic attack, and there are lots of pieces that need to work out for this attack. So we actually went on and implemented this on OpenSSH. So here is a success probability graph. On the y-axis, you can see we implemented this and we tried this 200 times, and on the y-axis you can see how many of these attacks succeeded over time, which is on the x-axis. An important thing to notice is that after around 5 minutes, around here, about 50% of the attacks successfully finished end-to-end. We could log in with our newly generated private key, and the reason for this is that it's not a 0 to 1, because we tried with many different public keys, and depending on how lucky we are with the physical memory that we get allocated to, then depending on these two factors, we could do the end-to-end attack sooner or later. Another interesting thing is that around 12 minutes, you could see that around 85% of the attacks finished successfully. From this point on, there is no more successful attacks. There are some issues with Rowhammer. So we have a reliability check that checks for after 5 bit flips, it would then choose this as a target. But sometimes we can't reproduce the bit flip. So we could retry again with a new piece of physical memory, but we haven't implemented it. But we think that if you spend a little bit more time on it, you could make this even more reliable. But even so, 80% of the 200 trials that we did were successful. So we think that the attack is quite real. So now we have done the OpenSSH attack, and then we are in the victim VM, and we're thinking, okay, what can we do with flip Feng Shui to escalate our privileges from a normal user to a root user? And so we came up with a bunch of targets that I'm going to briefly describe for you. So the first one is based on flipping the page table, the kernel page table pages that basically map kernel pages into the victim's address space. So if you could manipulate those, then it becomes quite easy to basically modify kernel memory. And once you can easily modify kernel memory from user space, it becomes quite easy to escalate your privilege to root. The other attack relies on corrupting file system information. So there are some file system information and there are some security sensitive data in there, like for example, the setuid bit. If you could corrupt that bit, then it also becomes quite easy to sort of like target flip feng shui to make binary setuid and then get root easily. And more interestingly, we think that the more interesting one is sort of like corrupting machine code. So if we can sort of like corrupt machine code, we could switch some instructions so that we could patch some security check. So for example, imagine that you have a pseudo binary and at some point there is a machine code that gets executed that checks whether your password was successful or not. And here, if you could patch that test, then it becomes quite easy for us to log in with a password which is not correct. All right, so I'm going to briefly go through these. So the first attack with the page tables, so remember that with flip feng shui, you need to know the content of the page that you want to target. And one nice thing about Linux kernel page tables is that their content is quite predictable. So during early boot, kernel allocates some physical pages, and this is quite predictable. And then it's going to put this information into this data structure that is used for mapping virtual addresses to physical addresses. And this content, since it is predictable, it can be easily targeted by flip feng shui. So we will mimic a kernel page table, and once the memory deduplication takes place, we do a bit flip in a location within the page table. Now, if you look at the page, if you open up a page table, there are a bunch of page table entries that map different locations within that virtual address to physical addresses. Now, each of these page table entries have a bit that is called the supervisor bit, and so like decides which privilege ring you need to be able to manipulate these pages. Now, if you bit flip that supervisor bit, then it becomes quite easy from any user process to basically manipulate kernel data. And once you can manipulate kernel data, it becomes quite easy to get escalate your privileges. The second attack relies on manipulating inodes. So if you think of file systems like ext4, they oftentimes have this data structure that maps a file to a location within the block device. So there's a pointer in there that says this file is at this location within the block device. There are also some other information. There's like access time, like creation date, like whether it's setuid, permissions, and things like that. But these are all information that you can easily get by doing a simple ls on a binary. But the information that you don't know and you need to have to be able to do flip feng shui is that pointer, right? And then we notice that if you do an installation of any Ubuntu or Debian system, this location of these binaries are so like if you know the size of the disk, which is also an information that you have with DF, for example, you know exactly where that file is going to end up. So you can also fabricate an inode. And once you have fabricated an inode, there is like this setuid bit that you can flip, which would then allow your application to execute things as root. So if you don't know, setuid is this Unix mechanism of implementing least privilege, so that the applications that require root only take this privilege access during a very short period of time. So you don't trust the entire binary, you only trust a very small part of this binary. And programmers oftentimes take extra care when writing this part so that it wouldn't become vulnerable to exploits. Now with flip feng shui, we could take almost any known binary, and then we could flip a bit and make it setuid. Now imagine if your VI is setuid, what could you do? You could basically do almost anything that you want and easily upgrade your local access. Finally, we also came up with this interesting attack, which is bit flipping machine code. So here is a sample source code that basically takes as an input a password and checks whether the password is correct or not in this verify function. So if you provide secret as your password, then the program is going to print OK. If not, it's going to say fail. And this is the original output of this program. It's quite simple, right? If you give it garbage, it's going to say fail. But if you give it the correct password, it's going to say that it's all OK. Now let's look at the binary representation of this program and its disassembly. So here on the left side, you're looking at the hex version of the binary, and then here you're looking at the disassembly. Let's try to bit flip some of these bits. So look at line 3. here. And I'm going to do a bit flip now. And suddenly, you can see that the instruction is changing. And it's becoming an AND now. Now, let's do a little bit more. So this is so like the opcode. If you do a little bit more, you can see that now the operands start to change. Now, most of these bit flips are not that good because they either result into incorrect behavior or they're going to lead to program crashes. But there is this one here that if you manage to bit flip, it changes JZ, which is jump if 0, the result of the test was 0, to jump if the result of the test was not 0. Now, this is corresponding to that verify function. So basically, if you do a bit flip at this opcode, then suddenly we are reversing the condition of the test that was checking for this password. Now, that would mean that if we have this bit flip, suddenly if we pass the secret, the original password, it's going to say fail. But if we pass the garbage, it's going to say OK. So basically, you could use this primitive to bit flip to patch many of the security-sensitive tests that you have in your application. And for example, you could use it on sudo or other application like maybe even OpenSSH to sort of like bypass the security tests. And this is also not going to be so easy to fix because most of the other stuff you can probably fix by doing a checksum, but this is binary getting executed by the processor, and it becomes quite expensive to check this all the time. All right, so now I've told you about the OpenSSH attack and the privilege escalation attack. But one of the requirements that they had and we didn't like was the fact that we needed to know the public key of the victim VM. And you might say that you don't always have this information, the public key. And it may make the attack a little bit more impractical than it needs to be. So we were going through this exercise of thinking, can we do an attack that is completely zero knowledge? So if you don't know anything about the victim, can you still use flip Feng Shui to basically compromise it? And Ben here is going to tell you about how this works.
Thank you. Thank you. OK. So indeed, so the final example attack we're going to show you, which is including a video demo, is going to have the goal is we're going to assume that our victim is running the apt-get package management system. So let's say it's an Ubuntu, Debian machine or the Ubuntu machine, and we assume that on a regular basis our victim does apt-get update and apt-get upgrade. Maybe it's even automatic nightly thing, which I think is quite common. So using in this scenario, we want to make the victim go to our repository, fetch the index from our repository, install our malicious, not authentic package. We're going to do core utils, because we want to backdoor ls. And we have it installed. And all of these checks are going to have to pass totally normally, like it's a totally normal day. So let's say, let's talk about how apt works a little bit. So apt-get has in etc app-source.list, there's this list of repositories that it goes to the URLs. It's a list of URLs of repositories where the package indexes are stored. So whenever you do an apt-get update, it's going to go through all those URLs to fetch all the new indexes and see what the new packages are or what the new versions are, if anything, and then you can upgrade them or remove them or whatever you want. But that's where the master lists are. Another important part of apt-get and an important part of its security is this keyring. This etc apt trusted.gpg is a GPG keyring file that contains public keys that apt trusts to authenticate packages. So it's a very nice end-to-end test that apt has built in. So it's a test both of authenticity and of integrity, because whenever a package were to be produced by a malicious person, they, of course, don't have a key that corresponds to any key in the keyring, so they can't make a good signature. And if a package were to be damaged in downloading, then the signature would also not match. So it's a very good authenticity and integrity test that GPG is used for. So nice end-to-end, it doesn't matter where you got it from. You don't have to test if the repository is trusted or not. No, you just test whether the signature is trusted or not. So that makes it really nice and end-to-end. However, if you want to subvert this security, then we're going to have to do, using flip Feng Shui, then we find that we can do 2 bit flips to subvert this security. So number 1, we want to flip a bit in the sources.list file, and using just one bit, we're going to be able to steer the victim from the real repositories to our malicious repository. So in the URL might say http://security.ubuntu.com/blah blah location, and we're going to change that to exactly the same URL but a different domain name. So all of these bit flips, all of the domain names that are one bit flip away, like ubun5u.com or something, I think is one of them, and ubunvu.com, we've registered them, by the way, just for precaution, but no one wants them, so we're none of the real owners want them, so we are starting an auction after this lesson, after this talk, for highest bidder gets them. So we've registered, ubunvu.com. If you find the right bitflip, we can send the victim to ubunvu.com because we can change the domain name that it's looking for in the file system cache. And we want to do it this way because then we don't have to rely on any funny tricks like no DNS spoofing, no connection hijacking, no getting lucky with network interception. It's just a totally normal DNS lookup, totally legitimate DNS lookup to a legitimate domain to our malicious repository, and that's where they end up then. Now, if we manage to send our victim to our malicious repository, then we still can't trick him into fetching the malicious package because the GPG signature is not right. So what we can do is also flip a bit in the trusted.gpg file. And just to remind you, these files are stock installs, right? So we're assuming it's very easy to predict the contents of these things because they're all the same after installation. That's why Feng Shui is so applicable here, and because it's easy to guess the contents of these files. Now, if we flip a bit in the public keys listed in trusted.gpg, they're 4096-bit keys, but still, so it's harder to factorize than the SSH keys, but still 5% of all the possible bit flips we were able to factorize in and therefore get the corresponding private keys. So if you manage to bit flip any of those, we can make a good signature that GPG will totally trust because it's supposed to, because the corresponding public key is in trusted.gpg. So that's how you can see no bugs of GPG or any other trickery were involved. It's all quite legitimate if you change these things. So we can use this computed private key, and because we can pre-compute many of the factorizations because the public keys are stock installs are years old. Ubuntu archive signing keys and that kind of thing. So let me show you the video demo that we have of this. This is a video demo. It was originally 20 minutes long, but and it's edited down to 2.5 minutes. Not because we're playing any tricks, but just because 20 minutes is too long. And we just want to show you the interesting parts. Okay. I'm going to occasionally interrupt it and talk over what's happening because it's quite brief. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see here? This is the attacker. He's doing he's doing Rowhammer. This is the victim, and the victim is doing totally normal victim things. Apt-get update and apt-get upgrade. And we're going to show you what's like before, during, and after the various bit flips that we're going to do. There's a request to turn down the lights. Is that possible? Thank you. Is that better? Yeah? Okay, so here's the victim. So let's first see, before we do any funny business, we're going to make the victim do normal apt-get update and apt-get upgrade and show you that there's nothing going on in the malicious. This is our malicious repository. This is the web server log of the malicious repository. So there's no funny business going on first. So there's an update happening, no activity here. Here we're looking for a sources.list bitflip. So the source.list file is going to get bitflip now, and that means that the victim is going to be sent to our malicious repository. So let's see if that's going to work. Now the deduplication is going to happen with the first bitflip, and then when the deduplication happens, the source.list file is changed. So let's see what happens when we do an apt-get update. All right, so now we have activity on our malicious repository. Great. Now GPG is saying, I found a funny package. The signature's not right. I'm not going to install it. So let's do an upgrade and see what happens. No packages are upgraded, just as it's supposed to do. Now, the next step is looking for a bitflip in the GPG key of the trusted GPG keyring. Because if we can do that, if we find the right one, then we can use one of our pre-computed private keys to generate a signature. We found a bitflip. Duplication is happening. Oh my goodness. Oh. Okay, so that's actually happened now. So now we see that in the output here, we know which bitflip has happened, and we select this bitflip here. It's a page offset, so that our malicious repository knows which private key to pick to sign the package and generate the repository. Oh my goodness. So what happens when we do the update now? I don't know. But remember, we're going to backdoor ls. Remember, we're going to backdoor core utils and specifically ls. So let's show you the normal behavior of ls. Here's ls. I hope you can read all this output. ls just says a bunch of random files in someone's home directory. But is that going to change after we do the upgrade? The upgrade happens. Is it going to accept the signature? Oh my goodness, it's going to accept the signature, and the upgrade happens. What happens to ls? It's backdoored. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's a demonstration of the apt-get attack. Videos of the OpenSH attack and of this thing. Also the unedited version is available on the website, which I'll show you later. Okay, so how has the reception of this work been? The reception, we have been lucky enough that the NCSC, that's the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center, has done disclosure for us. They did a very thorough professional job. They've contacted their counterparts in other countries, and they have notified Red Hat, Oracle, Xen, VMware, Debian as the OS vendors. Red Hat, Oracle, Xen, and VMware as the hypervisor vendors, Debian and Ubuntu as the OS vendors, and OpenSH and GPG as application vendors. So you can see this kind of the software stack which are affected by this work and are in a position to do mitigation. And GPG, all of the vendors gave an appropriate response before the time that this work became public. And GPG was the first to respond with a mitigation commit. So of course, we're very happy about that. So what should the conclusion be that we think that you should take away from this work? So we see that technique, this Feng Shui technique, it breaks the isolation that hardware-based virtualization is supposed to offer us, because the glitch in DRAM and not in the CPU. Now, we already knew, we'd long known that co-hosting VMs is risky, just like Kaveh showed you in his talk last year, Antonio. We know about many side channels. Deduplication is a source of a side channel. CPU cache attacks is a source of a side channel that allow you to leak very sensitive information even across VM boundaries in co-hosted VM conditions. But this is the first work that shows that you can, under these conditions, do have a reliable single-bit write primitive in a target VM, which, as you can see, has far-reaching security consequences. So, of course, we are recommending that everyone stick to the most straightforward mitigation, which is disabling memory deduplication, which a couple of Dutch, at least, that we know of, cloud providers have done as a result of this work. They weren't happy about it, but they take it seriously enough that they did this. Now, this is the URL of our research group. FUSEC is the Free University System Security Research Group in Amsterdam. And this URL is the project page for this particular project. So there's lots of background information there, an academic paper, many video demos, 1 minute introduction video, and lots of links to how the media has received this work. So take a look there if you're interested. That's all from us. Thank you for your attention. We are available now for questions if you wish.
You need to shout and repeat the question.
Oh yeah, so unfortunately there's no roving mic, but please go ahead. It has to, yes, is the question that the victim has to do manually in apt-get? Yes, absolutely. So we are indeed relying on the fact that the victim is doing the apt-get in its own time, apt-get upgrade, but we're assuming that either we can predict this or we simply do this this probing so often that sooner or later we're going to catch it. We have lots of opportunity to do this.
Also, like usually in the cron is often updating is run as a cron job, so we know already, okay, yeah, it's going to happen sooner or later.
Yes, please. How much time did it? Right. How much time did it take for companies to respond with a fix to this adequately? In the case of GPG, they were very fast. They're just a few weeks. Let me think. Some of the cloud hosting providers, they were also quite fast in turning off the duplication. All of the hypervisor vendors, in some cases, they said, we've already warned our customers about the danger. We're not going to do anything further. Some of them update the documentation to say, it's riskier. It was risky already. Now it's even riskier. So for the most part, we don't actually know of any vendors who've actually fixed it for real. The hypervisor vendor response for the most part has been change documentation, and the OS vendors have said meh, and the application vendors have said for the most part also meh.
So we're already quite happy that they disabled basically they patched the GPG to fix this. We wanted OpenSSH to also do this, but it didn't happen.
Yes, please. Yeah. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. So the question is, with this templating, you can only do one bit at a time, but how far can you get? Can you corrupt? Can you completely change a page to whatever you want? The answer to that is a bit complicated. It has to do with the intricacies of, because of the way the duplication works, after the duplication happens once, the physical address will never change, the physical page will never change again. It ends up in the KSM stable tree, and after that, the physical page will never change. And because of that, that's the template we're stuck with. So that's why in this particular implementation, at least, we can only do per page, we can only change one bit. That's the only thing that we rely on, at least.
So, but the offset is basically depends on how vulnerable the DRAM is, right? So in one of the test beds that we had, we noticed that we could almost like flip any bit within the page after like an hour or so. Yeah, so it depends quite a bit on how vulnerable the DRAM is. In the test bed that we were running, we could do like 28,000 bit flips of the 32,000. So a page is 4,096 bytes, 8 bits per byte, so 32,000 possibilities, about 32,000 possibilities. And we could do 28,000 in this test bed that we had. But depending on the vulnerability of the DIMM, you could get those much faster, or you could get them much, much slower, or not at all.
Yes, please. That's right. Okay, that's a good question. So this question is, the templates depend on where in physical memory you are, right? And where you hammer. So how do you predict where the template, right? So do you characterize all of the memory in your own VM first, or how do you do that? And the answer is indeed that's what we did. So we find, as soon as we know the page that we want to corrupt, and as soon as we know the offset within that page, the bit that we want to corrupt, then we go and do Rowhammer in our own VM over and over and over and over, just so long as that so long as we need until we find one of the possible offsets. Oftentimes we want not one particular one, but a range of ones. And we do sort of a meet in the middle of here are all the bits we can corrupt, here are all the factorizations we can do, and as soon as one meets the other, then in the case of OpenSSH, we have your question satisfactory.
So basically attack ourselves first to see which bit flips we can exploit before actually putting the target data there for the duplication to merge it.
Do we have time for more? We have no time for more, I think. Is that right? Okay.
But you can come talk to us in private.
Of course, yes. Thank you for your attention.